My dad's obsession with money destroyed our family. Now, after cutting him off, he's lost everything, and I've finally found peace. I'm 29 years old, and this is a story about my father, my family, and how money slowly tore us apart. Growing up, I had a pretty typical life. My dad, 55M, was an electrician, and my mom, 50F, worked part-time at a bakery. We weren't rich by any means, but we had everything we needed. My parents worked hard, and I always felt secure, loved, and cared for. We had a solid, working-class life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough for me. Then there was my grandfather, 80M. He was a different story. The man had money, lots of it. He owned several rental properties and had a successful business that he sold when I was in my teens. He didn't work anymore. He lived off the profits, and he was generous with the family. Whenever something came up, whether it was fixing the car, covering a medical bill, or helping out with an emergency, he was there with cash in hand. It was always framed as a kind gesture, and at the time, we were grateful for the help. It started small, a loan to help fix our old car, something my father could never have afforded on his own. My grandfather stepped in, and everything seemed fine. But looking back, I see now that this was where things began to change. After that first loan, my dad began to rely more and more on my grandfather. It started small, help with loan repayments or a new appliance, but then it escalated. It didn't take long before my dad stopped worrying about how we would pay for things. Instead, every time something went wrong, he would turn to my grandfather, no questions asked. And the bigger the problems, the bigger the requests became. Then came the house. My grandfather, having made a ton of money, decided to buy a house in the suburbs, and instead of selling it or renting it out, he gave it to my parents to live in, rent-free. It was a beautiful place, way nicer than anything we could have ever afforded, and at first it seemed like a blessing. But soon, I saw something changing in my father. He didn't need to work as hard anymore. With no rent, no real financial strain, he started acting different. He didn't have to work extra shifts or take on side jobs to make ends meet. Instead, he spent more time at home lounging around, complaining about trivial things. The pride he once had in working hard began to fade, and along with it, so did our relationship. It wasn't just that he wasn't working harder. He started distancing himself emotionally. Conversations at dinner became awkward. He didn't engage with me or my mom the way he used to. There was no more talking about our day. No more discussing plans for the future. It was like he didn't need us anymore. He had my grandfather to lean on for everything. My mom noticed this first. She was the one who saw the distance growing between all of us. She confronted him about it, but he dismissed her. "I'm just enjoying the good life now," he'd say. But it wasn't just about enjoying life. It was about relying on someone else. Someone who didn't hold him accountable. I started to feel irrelevant. Every time I tried to talk to my dad, it was like he didn't care. The more I grew up, the more independent I became. I worked hard at school. Then I got my first job. I didn't need my father's help, and I didn't want his approval either. I wanted to prove that I could make it on my own. But the more I worked to separate myself from his influence, the more he seemed to pull away. When I was 22, my dad asked me for a loan. He needed help buying a new car. I was still living at home, working part-time, and trying to figure things out for myself. I said no. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because I didn't want to enable his dependence. I knew he wasn't going to pay me back, and I knew that if I gave him the money, I'd be complicit in his reliance on others. I didn't want to be part of that cycle, and that refusal led to a massive argument. My dad called me selfish, accused me of turning my back on him, but I couldn't see it any other way. He wasn't interested in rebuilding our relationship. He was interested in what I could do for him financially. And that's when I realized my dad didn't love me the way he once did. His love had always been conditional. As long as I was part of his financial world, I mattered. The moment I stopped playing that role, I became invisible to him. The truth hit hard. My father wasn't the man I thought he was. He was more interested in money than in family. And my grandfather, despite his good intentions, had made him that way. It wasn't that my dad didn't love me. It was that his love had become entangled with what he could get. And once I wasn't useful to him, I stopped being a priority. Looking back, I can see the calm before the storm. It was a slow build-up. One loan here, one free house there, one ignored conversation after another. But that was just the beginning. Things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Update 1. A year ago, I got engaged to my fiancée, a wonderful woman 27F, who's been my rock through all the ups and downs in life. She's been incredibly supportive, especially with everything that's been going on with my family. I thought getting married would bring my family closer together. I was wrong. When we started planning our wedding, I decided to invite my dad. After all, he's still my father, despite everything that had happened. At first, he seemed genuinely excited. He said all the right things about how proud he was of me, how much he looked forward to the wedding, and how he couldn't wait to see me get married. But I should have known something was off when he suddenly asked to meet me one afternoon. We sat down, and he dropped the bombshell. He wanted my grandfather to pay for the wedding. Not just a little bit, but cover the entire thing. Venue, catering, everything. And it wasn't just a suggestion. It was more like an expectation. He didn't ask me, or my fiancée, how he felt about it. He told me Grandpa has the money, and he owes it to us to help out. I sat there, stunned. To be clear, my grandfather had already helped out over the years. Fixing cars, paying for repairs, offering the occasional gift or loan. But this was different. He wasn't just offering help. My father was demanding it. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a request. My dad had come to see my grandfather as a personal bank. When I brought it up to my fiancée, she was furious. She didn't come for money. And the idea of asking my grandfather to foot the entire bill didn't sit well with her. She felt uncomfortable even discussing it. I couldn't blame her. She'd worked hard for everything she had. And the idea of depending on someone else for our wedding felt wrong to her. We had saved up a decent amount for the wedding ourselves. And it wasn't that we couldn't afford it, but we didn't want to put that financial strain on anyone else. I told my dad I wasn't going to ask my grandfather for money. I wasn't going to keep enabling his behavior. His response? He exploded. He started accusing me of not caring about family, of not understanding how hard things had been for him, and that I was turning my back on him. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about my dad's obsession with money. I tried to explain that I wasn't asking him to pay for the whole wedding, but he wasn't listening. He was too focused on what my grandfather could give him. Things only got worse from there. Word got back to my grandfather about the argument, and he called me. He said he didn't want to get involved in the drama, but that he'd be happy to help with the wedding expenses if it was through my dad. Essentially, he was offering money, but only if it meant my father would still be the one to manage it. This just made everything worse. I told him I didn't want his money if it meant my dad was going to keep depending on him for everything. That didn't go over well. My father was beyond furious. He couldn't believe I was turning down help from family. He called me selfish, accused me of cutting him out of my life for good. The thing is, it wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about the principle. I wasn't going to keep playing along with my dad's idea that money equals love. If I wasn't giving him money, I was nothing to him. That was his view. By this point, things had gotten so tense that my mom was caught in the middle. She sided with me, trying to explain that this was about setting boundaries, but my dad wasn't hearing it. He was so fixated on the idea of my grandfather paying for the wedding that he made it clear he wouldn't attend if my grandfather wasn't involved financially. And that's when I realized it wasn't about the wedding. It was about him wanting my grandfather to foot the bill for everything in his life. The days leading up to the wedding were exhausting. I spent more time arguing with my dad than planning the wedding. The stress of it all started affecting me. I could feel the emotional toll it was taking. It wasn't about a celebration of love and commitment anymore. It had become a power struggle over money, and my father's side of the family was only too happy to let it happen. Then, on the day of the wedding, I looked around and realized my dad wasn't there. He had decided not to come because my grandfather wasn't helping him. He made it clear that without his financial involvement, he wouldn't be there to celebrate my special day. That was the breaking point. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about my whole relationship with my father. He'd made it clear that he didn't care about being there for me as a parent. He cared about what I could do for him financially. After the wedding, I tried to reach out to my dad. I wanted to fix things. I wanted a relationship that wasn't tainted by money. But he ignored me. He was too deep in his own world to care about rebuilding what we once had. That's when I realized that my father wasn't the man I thought he was. His love for me had always been conditional, tied to what he could get. I couldn't let that affect my life any longer. Update to a few months after the wedding. Just when I thought things might start to settle down, my father called me in a panic. He claimed that he was in serious financial trouble and needed help paying for his bills. At first, I wasn't sure how serious he was. He'd always had a way of making things sound worse than they were. But when I dug into the situation, it became clear that he wasn't exaggerating. He was in deep. It turns out that for months, my dad had been living beyond his means. He'd started taking out loans, maxing out credit cards, and buying things he couldn't afford. My mother confirmed it when I asked her. She told me that he hadn't been working for months. He wasn't just avoiding extra shifts. He had stopped working entirely. The house my grandfather had given him was beautiful, but it wasn't enough. He'd kept racking up expenses, and now he was asking me for help. I didn't know what to say. I'd been down this road before, with him relying on my grandfather and asking me for money. I couldn't just give him money to bail him out of a situation he'd created for himself. I had my own savings to think about and responsibilities of my own. I didn't feel it was my place to fix his financial mistakes. The guilt trip came quickly. My dad told me, "I raised you, and this is how you repay me." It wasn't the first time he tried to pull that card, but it hit harder this time. I realized that this was exactly what he was doing. He wasn't asking for help out of necessity. He was asking because he expected me to help him. It wasn't about him being in trouble. It was about him being entitled to my money, just like he'd always been entitled to my grandfather's. Despite my refusal, my grandfather stepped in again. He offered to help my dad financially, but this time, my father turned him down. His pride had gotten in the way. He didn't want to accept help from anyone, even though it was clear he needed it. It was like he couldn't admit to his own failures, so he chose to keep digging himself deeper into debt, rather than take the help that was available. In the meantime, communication with my dad broke down completely. He stopped calling me unless it was to complain about his situation. There was no interest in fixing our relationship, no attempt at reconciliation. It was always the same story. He was in trouble, needed help, and I wasn't doing enough. My mother and I had regular talks about what was going on, but she seemed resigned to his behavior. She had spent years trying to make things work, and it was clear she had given up trying to change him. What frustrated me most was that my father refused to make any real changes. He still had the house that my grandfather had given him, but he refused to sell it, even though it was far too large for one person. He kept pouring money into maintaining it, even though he couldn't afford it. The bills piled up, and he continued to make excuses. He was living beyond his means, and it was obvious that he wasn't trying to fix it. He just wanted anyone, to keep paying for it. I found myself stuck in a moral dilemma. On one hand, I didn't want to see my dad suffer, but on the other hand, I knew that every time I helped, I was just enabling his irresponsible behavior. My fiancée could see it too. She was frustrated with me for constantly dealing with my dad's issues. She didn't want to be dragged into this dysfunction, and I couldn't blame her. I had been dealing with it for years, but now it was affecting my life and my relationship with her. The isolation started to set in. Every time I said no to my father's requests, he would get angry and guilt-trip me. When I said no to helping with his bills, I felt like I was abandoning him. But the reality was, every time I stepped in, things never got better. He'd promised to change, but nothing ever changed. His pattern of behavior was always the same, and I realized that I couldn't keep getting caught in it. It all came to a head one day after a particularly nasty phone call. My dad had once again asked for money, and I refused. He lashed out, accusing me of abandoning him, saying that I was just like everyone else who had turned their back on him. It was a harsh call, and I couldn't take it anymore. That was the final straw. I decided to cut off contact with him for a while. I knew it was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. The truth hit me hard. I realized that my father's love for me had always been conditional. It wasn't about family or love or support. It was about what I could give him. The more I helped, the more he took. When I stopped giving, I became invisible to him. A few weeks later, my dad reached out to me again. This time he said he was sorry for how he had acted, but I knew it was just another attempt to get me to help him. I had given him chance after chance, but nothing ever changed. I was done. Adios. I had come to terms with the fact that my father didn't love me the way I needed him to. His love had always been tied to financial support. He needed me to bail him out. But the truth was, I couldn't do it anymore. I had to prioritize my own life, my relationship, and my values. I couldn't let his financial issues define my existence anymore. Update 3. It had been 6 months since I cut contact with my dad. I was starting to feel some relief, like the weight of all his demands and emotional manipulation was lifting off my shoulders. I was focused on my own life, my relationship, and moving forward. But of course, I should have known better. It was never that simple. One afternoon, I got a call from him. It wasn't the usual guilt trip or a demand for money. This time, my father was desperate. He claimed that he had nowhere to go. He told me that he'd been kicked out of the house my grandfather had given him. Apparently, my dad had stopped making any effort to take care of the property, and my grandfather had finally had enough. He told my dad that he needed to figure things out on his own. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't even sure if I believed him. Part of me felt guilty. This was my father, after all. But the other part of me felt like I had been through enough. My mom, though, called me in tears. She said my dad was unbearable to live with. He was sinking into depression, and she didn't know what to do. She begged me to help him. I felt trapped. On one hand, he was my dad, and he was in trouble. On the other hand, this was the same man who had manipulated me for years. I didn't know if I could take another round of emotional blackmail. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. My father didn't give up. He called me a few days later, asking if he could stay with me and my fiancée for a while until he got back on his feet. We had just moved into a new apartment, and the idea of him living with us was overwhelming. My fiancée was understandably uncomfortable with it. She had been supportive of me through everything, but having my father in our space would have been too much. I set my boundaries again. I told my dad that I couldn't let him move in with us. I explained that while I cared about him, he needed to start taking responsibility for his own actions. He couldn't keep relying on me, my fiancée, or my grandfather to clean up his mess. His reaction was explosive. He accused me of being cold-hearted, selfish, and turning my back on him. He reminded me how much he had given up for me over the years. "I've done everything for you, and now you're treating me like this," he said. It felt like an emotional punch. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should have offered him some help, even just a place to stay. But then I remembered everything he had put me through. The years of financial manipulation, the emotional neglect, the constant sense of entitlement. It was always about him, about what he needed, what he wanted, and how he could get it from me or my grandfather. I couldn't let myself fall back into that trap. My fiancée stood by me, reminding me that I couldn't let my father continue to take advantage of me. She reminded me of the emotional toll his behavior had taken on our relationship. She said I had done enough, that it was time for him to start figuring things out on his own. A few days later, my father called again. This time, his voice was shaky. He was crying. He told me that he had nowhere else to go and that he'd end up on the streets if I didn't help him. The weight of his words hit me hard. It felt like he was pushing all my buttons again, making me feel guilty for not helping him. I started to feel the pressure. I agreed to meet him in person to talk things through. We met at a coffee shop, and for the first time in years, he seemed genuinely vulnerable. He admitted that he had made terrible choices, that he was scared of what his future held. He said that losing the house had been the final blow, and now he didn't know where to turn. I listened to him. It was the first time he'd ever taken accountability for his actions. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming anyone else. It was like he was finally owning up to the fact that his life had spiraled out of control. But I couldn't ignore the years of behavior that had led to this point. That afternoon, my grandfather called me. I wasn't expecting it. He apologized for how he had treated both me and my father. He said he realized that he had been enabling my dad's behavior for too long, and that he wanted to find a way to help him without making him reliant on handouts. It was unexpected, but I could hear the regret in his voice. After discussing it with my fiancée and my grandfather, I decided to offer my father a compromise. I told him he could stay in a small guest house my grandfather owned for a few months, but only if he made a real effort to change his life. He needed to find a job, take responsibility for his actions, and stop relying on others to fix things for him. No more free rides. My father reluctantly agreed. I could tell he was hurt by the conditions I set, but he accepted them. It felt like a bittersweet victory. I had set my boundaries, but I knew that the relationship was still fractured. Things weren't magically fixed. He was still the same person, and I wasn't sure if he would ever truly change, but at least I had done what I could to help him while still protecting myself. The situation wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing the right thing. I had set clear boundaries, and I had given him a chance to prove that he could take responsibility. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. Update 4. Things didn't go as smoothly as I hoped when my father moved into the guest house my grandfather had offered him. At first, it seemed like he was actually trying. He got a part-time job, started doing some minor repairs around the guest house, and even seemed like he was taking some responsibility for himself. For a brief moment, it felt like there might be hope. Maybe he was finally getting the message that he couldn't just rely on others forever. But that didn't last long. Within a few weeks, I started noticing that his effort was fading. He spent more and more time on his hobbies, stuff like watching TV and working on his old car, and less time focusing on getting his life together. The job he had taken wasn't full-time, but it seemed like he wasn't even trying to make it work. He'd complain about the hours or how hard it was to find better work at his age. I'd hear him make excuses like, "It's hard to get good hours at my age," or "I'll never make the kind of money I used to." The same excuses I had heard for years. It was like he wasn't even trying to help himself. I wasn't the only one noticing it. My fiancée, who had been supportive up until now, was growing frustrated. She saw him living in the guest house, taking things easy, and she could tell he wasn't really doing the work to get back on his feet. She didn't want to be dragged into the dysfunction anymore. I had tried to make it clear that this was temporary, that my father needed to prove he could handle things on his own, but nothing had changed. He was still relying on everyone else. It all came to a head one night when my father invited us over to the guest house for dinner. He had made some excuse about how he was doing the best he could, but when we sat down it quickly became clear that wasn't true. He started complaining about his job, saying it wasn't enough to live on. He didn't like the hours or the pay. I told him it wasn't an excuse. If he was serious about making a change, he needed to try harder. The world had changed, but that didn't mean he couldn't find a way to support himself. His response was quick and defensive. "You think I don't know that? I'm trying, but the world's changed. You don't understand how hard it is to get ahead these days." At that moment it hit me. I had heard these same excuses for years. The world might have changed, but that didn't mean he couldn't adapt or put in the effort. It was the same story he had been telling for years, and I couldn't keep letting him off the hook. But even after everything, it was hard to break the emotional cycle. Every time I tried to push him, it felt like I was being dragged back into the same old patterns. I didn't want to be stuck in this cycle of disappointment and frustration, but it was hard to keep saying no. A few days after that dinner, my grandfather called me. He was worried about my father. He didn't want my dad to turn into a permanent guest in the guest house. He had hoped that this would push my father to get back on his feet. But instead, he was seeing the same behavior from my dad, no real effort, just lip service. I knew my grandfather was right, but it didn't make it any easier. My father wasn't even pretending to change anymore. He had started asking my grandfather for more financial help, despite being given the opportunity to work and take care of himself. It was like nothing had changed. That was when I realized I couldn't let this continue. I had to set firmer boundaries. I called my father and told him that he needed to make a real effort to get back on his feet. If he didn't show significant progress in the next month, he would have to leave the guest house. He didn't take the news well. He exploded, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of always being the perfect child who never needed anything. That was the moment it became clear no matter what I did, he would never see me as an equal. In his eyes, I was the one who had it all together, and he was the one who had given up everything for me. I realized then that I couldn't keep waiting for him to change. No matter how much I wanted him to, he wasn't going to. The situation forced me to confront my feelings of resentment. I had spent so much of my life hoping he would change, that one day he would step up and become the father I needed. But it had never happened. I had done everything I could, and it wasn't enough. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about him refusing to take responsibility for his actions. I gave him one final warning. I told him that if he didn't show real progress within the next month, he would have to leave the guest house. It was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. I didn't want to kick him out, but I couldn't continue to enable him either. I had to protect my own life and my relationship, and I couldn't keep letting him drag me into his mess. Despite my warning, my father continued to deny that there was anything wrong with his behavior. He still believed I was being unfair, and it became clear that he wasn't going to change. I had done everything I could to help him, but it was time to let him figure things out on his own. I realized that no matter how much I wanted him to be different, he would always be the same, and as much as it hurt to admit it, I had to let go. A month had passed since I gave my father that final warning. There had been no change. He wasn't putting in the effort to find full-time work, and he was still leaning on my grandfather for support. My dad had no intention of changing. He wanted everything handed to him without taking any real responsibility. It became clear to me that he wasn't going to change. Not for me. Not for anyone. I had to follow through with my decision. I told him that he needed to leave the guest house. It was time. He had been given every chance, and nothing had changed. He was furious. He immediately accused me of abandoning him. He said I was being heartless, that I was turning my back on him after everything he had done for me. But I stood my ground. He had shown me time and time again that his love was conditional, and I wasn't going to let that continue. The fallout was immediate. My father stopped speaking to me. When he did contact me, it was just to accuse me of being cruel. He kept telling me how heartless I was, that I was abandoning him when he needed me the most. I felt a deep sense of loss, but there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells, afraid to say no. I had made the decision, and I was sticking to it. My grandfather, who had always been involved in the financial side of things, stepped in again. He offered to help my father find a new place to live. But this time he made it clear that my dad had to prove he could take care of himself first. My grandfather wasn't going to be enabling him any longer. He was done watching my father drag us both down. Over the following weeks, I came to terms with something I had been avoiding for a long time. My father was never going to be the person I wanted him to be. His actions had shown me that he was more interested in using others for support than in changing his life. He wasn't going to take responsibility for his actions, and I couldn't keep waiting for him to. It was painful, but I had to accept that he wasn't going to change. My mom took the news hard. She was heartbroken by the separation, but she understood why I had to make this choice. She had been living with the same frustration for years. She had hoped he would change, just like I had, but deep down I think she knew he wouldn't. She was just as tired of carrying him as I was, but it still hurt her to see our family torn apart like this. I sent my father a final letter. I told him that I would always love him, but I couldn't continue to enable his toxic behavior. I couldn't keep pretending that things would change when they never did. I told him it was time for both of us to move on. I needed to move on with my life, and that meant stepping away from the constant cycle of emotional manipulation. Letting go wasn't easy. Despite the decision, I found myself grieving the loss of the father I thought I had, the one I had always hoped would change. It was hard to accept that the man I had been trying to fix was never going to be the man I wanted him to be. But deep down, I knew it was the only way I could have a healthy future. I couldn't keep letting his failures dictate my life. Throughout all of this, my fiancée was there for me. She supported me every step of the way. She knew how much this had affected me, and she helped me through the tough moments. She never once doubted my decision. She reminded me that I had done everything I could to help my father, but it was time for me to protect myself and our relationship. The experience taught me a lot about myself. I grew stronger. It wasn't easy, but I learned the importance of setting boundaries, even when it's painful. I learned that sometimes love isn't enough. It's not enough to just hope things will get better. Sometimes you have to walk away in order to save yourself. As the weeks passed, I started to feel lighter. The tension that had been hanging over me for years started to dissipate. My father tried reaching out a few times after he left the guest house. He sent me messages, asking if I was willing to talk. He said he was sorry for everything, but I remained firm. I wasn't going to be manipulated into helping him anymore. Slowly, my life started to return to normal. The constant worry, the guilt, the anxiety, all of it began to fade away. It felt freeing to not have to carry the weight of his problems anymore. I started focusing on my future, not tied to the toxic relationship with my father. I could plan for my future without the constant fear of his demands hanging over me. Healing was a slow process. My relationship with my mother improved as well. She no longer had to carry the burden of my father's failures alone. She found peace, knowing that I wasn't going to be dragged into his cycle anymore. We could finally talk without the tension that had been there for so long. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was the right choice. It was the only way for me to move on with my life. I had to accept the reality of who my father was, rather than the person I wanted him to be. It wasn't easy, but now I'm free. Free from the constant emotional manipulation. Free to live my life, build my future, and focus on what truly matters. I have no regrets.